But again, I guess question to you, if anybody feels that this is a good agenda or any proposals for additions or changes? Okay, that's all good. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second just to see your faces again. Because that's so much nicer. So the agenda is basically aiming for me to do a quick introduction again of what is Scholix and what is it about. I do realize that looking at who's here, that at least half of you have seen many of these slides before. So I'll do it quickly. Now, the good news is there are a couple of new things in there. So even for those of you who have seen much of what is Scholix before, there will be new slides. But because I see so many of you who've already seen, let's say, what is Scholix and what it's about, I'm going to do that very quickly and then move over to more the Scholix for publishers. So Rachel, Joris, and Martin are going to take the publisher perspective. How can we get more uptake on publishers contributing data sharing links? Then we're going to take the data side perspective. So Helena Kuzijn is going to talk about data side and the progress we're making from that perspective. Then Paolo is going to step in from OpenAir and give us a download of actually what has happened across the board. How big is Scholix now, and what is the growth, and what are the exciting things that we are seeing? And then last but not least, we're going into a discussion on next steps and, let's say, things we could do next. Even though this is a working group that is in what is called maintenance mode. Maintenance means we're still meeting every month. We're still actually pretty active, increasing our collaborations and our uptake, and we're seeing growth almost every month. So I'd say for a maintenance working group, I'd rather call this business as usual working group. Welcome to our business as usual working group, Scholix. So it's 5 past the hour. Does anybody have objection if I kick off? All right. So as said, I'd like to give you a quick overview of Scholix. And Scholix is to link research with literature. It's very simple. We want to make sure that the data sets that are published on data repositories or data centers have links to articles in journals or books. That's it. There is some discussion about what is a data set. So we do also see software links to articles, but in general, the main use of Scholix is data sets to articles and articles to data sets. It's as simple as that. Why is that good? Very simple, because in the past, there were many one-to-one relationships between publishers collecting links from repositories, repositories collecting links from papers, and data centers doing the same thing. Now we're concentrating these article to data links into hubs. So for example, Crossref, DataSite, OpenAir, and actually PMC is doing similar work. So we're collecting these links in hubs and exchanging that information with anyone who wants to have that information or get access to it. So if you map Scholix to the FAIR principles, we are really about the F in FAIR. Scholix will not help you to make data more accessible. It also does not help to make data more interoperable. Although you could say, if you see the article as metadata for the data, so the article containing the text of how the data was created and what conclusions were drawn from it. In that sense, Scholix does help to make data more interoperable. But let's be honest, it's really about making data findable and connected to the articles, and vice versa. You can see all of this in Scholix.org guidelines. But in essence, it is a simple information model where the package contains on the top when it was published, who provided this information, so you can assess the credibility. What is the relationship type? For example, is it related to, or is it supplement to, or is it referenced by? So the relationship is directional, and it's from a source object to a target object. So it can be from a data set to an article, or from an article to a data set. And as you can see, the mandatory fields are really about the DOI or PID, and what is the type. So is it an article or a data set? Or, and this is where we actually hand over to Martin, because the or, can it be software? Can it be, for example, we had discussions in the past, can it be physical objects? Can it be software? This is kind of a discussion item. We do see that people use it for those kind of relationships as well. But our intention when we launched this was to make it a data set to article link only. I'm actually happy to see that it's slowly expanding. So what are the benefits? Well, actually, really simply put, let me start with data repositories and publishers. For them, it's increasing visibility, improving the user experience, and making it more scalable and robust. For research institutes and bibliographic service providers, it's actually very easy now to start measuring outcomes, not in terms of citations and articles, but it also helps to start tracking data outcomes. And what I mean by that is that it will help, for example, institutions and funding bodies to better track whether where their data is ending up and what the outcome of that was, because it's not that easy to make that link. And for researchers, it's just easier to find the data related to an article, or if you have the data, it's easier to find the article related to that data set. And it helps to track the long-term impact. So let me give you some examples. So if you take the publisher to repository relationship, it used to be, for example, and I'm taking a wonderful example from Germany, the GFZ data services. So basically, the data was published in 2016. And then actually the article, which was published in 2011, does not have a supplement. So the problem with that is that when the article is published, it's kind of immutable. And you can't just start adding data to it in the traditional flow. So this actually breaks. It's very easy to add in the later data publication a link back to the paper. So that's quite easy. But of course, it's harder to add that link back to the data set. So with Scholix, that is actually possible. So it's actually by sending that link to DataSite, the publisher then picks up that link and says, that's interesting. There is actually related data to this article, and puts it at the bottom of the article in the relevant section, research data for this article. So that helps to make the data findable, because not in every case the data and the article will be published at the same time. Of course, you can imagine many other examples. The nice thing is that actually the uptake is really nice, and actually Martin and Rachel will talk about that from the publisher perspective, and then Helena will talk about it from the data side perspective. Now, actually, let's look at some examples. So given the fact that we are in Costa Rica, I did an analysis using Scholix we linked the corpus to Scopus, and using that, we can now dissect very easily where data is published. So, for example, I took all North and South American data that was linked to articles, and then I dissected it by country. And you can see that obviously the big countries publish more data and the smaller countries publish less data. And it's nice to see that Costa Rica is among the countries that publish data. And what is even nicer is that using this analysis, using this relationship between articles and data sets, you can start to do bibliometric analyses. So for example, we took, in this case, the United States. We looked at all the United States articles and proceedings, and we looked at two dimensions. We looked at international collaboration and how often are these articles cited. And if you look at the big blue bubble in the middle, you can see that on average in the US, 33% of US outputs lead to international collaborations or are in combination with international collaborations, and roughly 7.5% are in the top 10 citation percentiles. Some of you may recognize this graph. It comes from SciVal. So in Elsevier, where I work, we put all this data into SciVal. So we use the open database Scholix. We enrich it with Scopus. We stuff it into SciVal, and then you can make these kind of analyses. The nice thing, what we now show, is that if you look at those articles that have related data, and that's where Scholix comes in. If you look at those articles that have related data, and that's the little bubble on the top right, you see that it correlates highly with more international collaborations, and it correlates highly with higher citation percentiles. Obviously, you may ask, well, maybe more higher quality or higher impact journals require more data sharing. Could be, but in a way, what we've also analyzed is that actually this kind of holds across the board. So it really is not that much journal dependent. So in any journal quadrant, you'll see that actually sharing data helps in terms of international collaborations and top citations. Just as we are near the US, let me do another example, Mexico. You see the same correlation. So you see that international collaboration seems to have a higher impact. You see that international collaboration correlates with sharing data, and the same goes for top citation percentiles. You can also zoom into institutions. So I zoomed into Costa Rica. And you can see which universities share data. And the only reason we can do that is not because the universities actually tag the data sets. The researchers generally are not that great at tagging all these millions and thousands of data sets that just end up all over the world. So by linking that to articles, we're now able to classify that as, that's a University of Costa Rica data set, because we can link the author together with the article. Another example is that you can combine Scholix and Scopus to find data sets for any institutions. So I'm showing here the University of Milano Bicocca, which actually uses the same techniques to show data sets that are linked to articles. And I see that there's a chat question. Sorry, let me pause for a second. Thank you, Paolo. Paolo is saying that I'm mentioning Scholix, but I should be mentioning Scholexplorer. Very true. Let me actually get back to that later on, because there is a little bit of a difference. Let me continue. I'll get back to that in a moment. So I'm calling this Scholix because it's the Scholix technique to link articles to data sets. But it's true, we're getting these links from the Scholix API that OpenAIRE provides. And last but not least, it's easier for researchers, because researchers find data pretty frequently through the article. And another example, which in this case is correctly marked with Scholix Explorer. So Scholix Explorer provides these Scholix links. And basically, for example, Scopus publishes those links alongside the article. In this case, a CCDC dataset. Now, this is actually where I want to kind of discuss the difference between Scholix and Scholix Explorer. Scholix is the guideline, or it's the method. What happens is typically that Crossref collects Scholix links from publishers. DataSite collects Scholix links from data repositories. OpenAir actually collects these links from anybody and also combines the links from Crossref and DataSite and actually PubMed into a larger database where basically anything can be extracted. What the examples I just showed were actually coming from Scholix Explorer, which we then deduplicated and cleaned up a little bit, because the problem with a really large database is that you always need to be a little bit of screening, because otherwise you'll end up with lots of duplications. But actually the nice thing is it's a really useful database, and actually it leads to the results that I just showed. So where do we stand? I started off by saying that we are in maintenance. That's exactly what we are. But I hope the examples show you that we are a little bit beyond maintenance. We are a business as usual, growing fast, and actually the numbers to that will come from the speakers after me. I already talked about this. So thank you. Happy to be discussing this and soon handing over to Rachel from Crossref. But before I do so, are there any questions that you may have? I'm going to stop sharing. Complete silence. So I guess all of you saw this so many times and
oh, it's late for some of us. Let's see. Yeah.
True. It's late for me. Well, in case there are no questions, then I suggest we move on to Rachel and Martin.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds good. Let me just get our let me just share my screen and get our slide deck up. Sorry, bear with me.
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Bingo. Okay, good stuff.
Yeah, perfect.
Brilliant. Okay. So yeah, it's we've got just a short presentation about how we're supporting data citation and Scholix at Crossref. So I'm not presenting on my own this evening. So I'm Rachel Lammy, I'm Head of Special Programs at Crossref, and I'm joined by my colleague Martin Rittman, who's the product manager for Crossref's event data service, among other things, but that's tied into the work that we've been doing with data citation and with Scholix. I know that a lot of you who are joining us today are familiar with Crossref already. For those who aren't, just to give you a kind of idea of what we do and who we work with, we have over 12,000 member organisations. We are a not-for-profit member organisation, and we report to a 16-person member board who are a cross-section of our members. And we have a metadata store of over 116 million scholarly content items, lots of journal articles, but also books, book chapters, preprints, conference proceedings, and other research outputs. A lot of people will be familiar with Crossref because of the DOI, but we've built a lot of services off the back of the DOIs and the associated metadata to help ensure that scholarly research can be registered, linked, and distributed. And part of that involves working with other DOI registration agencies like DataCite. And the important thing is not just preserving that metadata or making the DOIs live, but actually receiving it and making it available via open APIs and search interfaces. We see lots of queries across our different interfaces, and that's why that's the usage of the DOIs, the identifiers, and the associated metadata is really what's important in terms of making everything hang together. So I think our key message today is really about how sending data citations to data with Crossref helps make them free. So our key message is really that registering citations to data in your Crossref metadata, that helps this information go further. And it maximizes the potential for reuse of this information by the whole research community. And I'll give a couple of examples later in the presentation. As Wouter said, it's pretty simple in that sending citations to data in Crossref metadata means that we can make them available via our event data API and other APIs. And within that, we also have a Scholix endpoint, and we deliver data to other Scholix endpoints as well. So that's kind of the key message. But this is how you do it. So part of what I've sort of realized in my time working, sort of being part of the Scholix working group, is that the key things from our side is that we want to have, to make this all hang together, is that we need to connect up this whole workflow. And I know that other RDA groups are making inroads and doing great work in other pieces of this workflow. But having a policy for data citation at the publisher or at the journal level is really key to making sure that the information on the data connected to articles or other research outputs makes it the whole way through the publication process. Submission, acceptance, and through to publication. So working with authors and having submission systems like ScholarOne and Editorial Manager support the collection of links to data upon submission. Making sure that the publisher production processes are looking for these references to data and format and treat them correctly. And then that those links are published online alongside the paper. But from our side, the information on those links needs to be sent in a structured format to Crossref as well, so that we can make them available in a computer readable way. So up to the point of the last slide was really talking about sort of what publishers need to do and working with researchers in terms of making that information flow through the systems. From the Crossref side, we do a couple of things. So we accept the deposit of metadata, including data citations, in the bibliography section of the metadata of our schema. And then we try to match that. So things that we look at are, in that reference list, are there DOI tags with DOIs in them that are referencing data? So are they DataCite DOIs? Or is it a structured reference? This is something that we'll start to look at, that we can look at and identify as a data citation. Again, we'll show some examples of this in the upcoming slides. And then from the output side, once we can identify those citations to data, either looking at the DOIs or the structured references, then we'll add that to our event data service. And then that also gets made available in Scholix format. So this, from our perspective, the Scholix data is a subset of the event data, and that contains only those data citations in the Scholix format. Martin, I think I'm handing over to you at this point.
Yep, yeah, that's correct. So yeah, brief hello to everyone from me. It's really nice to have the opportunity to present here. And so yeah, I'm just going to give a few examples of really in practice, what does a data citation or data reference look like from the Crossref point of view, and how can publishers make sure that we're picking up their data citations and delivering them through our Scholix endpoint. So you can see on this slide an example of some XML with a citation which has a key and a DOI tag. And we will recognize that DOI tag as coming from DataCite and create a data citation or data reference from it and add that to Scholix. And this is the minimum amount of information that needs to be included in the references that are deposited with Crossref. And I guess there's 2 points to make here. The first is that, you know, there's quite an onus on the production side, the typesetters, copy editors, and so on, to include the data citations, data references in the bibliography, not just mentioned in passing in the text somewhere, and to make sure that this DOI tag is being used. This is really important for us to identify what's being cited. And yeah, here's a couple of examples of this in practice. Yeah, MDPI takes a very simple approach, just has this minimal amount of information, the citation key and the DOI. From the Scholix point of view, that's absolutely fine for us. At the bottom of the slide, Nature Scientific Data add more metadata. They have the author, they have the year. They also have the unstructured citation information, and you'll see that the DOI is also mentioned in the unstructured citation. If you mention that without having the DOI as a separate tag, unfortunately, we don't kind of dig into the unstructured citation to pick up the DataCite DOI, so that wouldn't be picked up as a data link data citation by us. Coming soon is this is what Rachel was kind of alluding to in terms of structured data, structured information. I think that you will be able to add a publication type into the citation tag. So this is an attribute that says this is a data reference. We're referencing something here that's data, and it will be in the schema release, which is probably due early-ish next year. We don't have an exact date yet, but that will be a way for publishers to help us identify even better where a reference is to data and help us to filter that into our Scholix endpoint. Yeah, so Rachel, can you go on to the next slide? Yeah, so this is just to kind of reiterate that, and also in the future, looking beyond that, we plan to include data availability statements in Crossref metadata. And if a publisher deposits a data availability statement with us, then we can look through that to find DOIs or other identifiers and create data linking events from that. So yeah, a few words about how event data relates to Scholix. I think as was kind of mentioned before, Scholix really refers to the schema, but we operate a Scholix endpoint the Crossref event data is basically a collection of all sorts of mentions of Crossref articles and works from across the internet. So that might be, you know, Wikipedia, something on Wikipedia, on Twitter, in a news article, and also from DataCite and other similar agencies. They get put into the event data bus, which is the big circle in the middle here, available through an API, and then a subset of this goes into the Scholix endpoint. And a couple of things to say about that. First, the format is different. There's a different schema for event data to Scholix. And the second is that we are performing some kind of maintenance on event data at the moment. And our Scholix endpoint, I checked it earlier, and is unfortunately not working at the moment, which I guess is bad timing for this presentation. But you know, it's something we're obviously very committed to providing, and all the data is available. The same data is available in event data. A subset of that is available through Scholix as well. And with that, I can pass back to Rachel.
Thanks. Yeah, my job is just to sum up, really.
Rachel, before you do, there's a question for Martin in the chat. If you want, I can read it out.
Yes, sure, I didn't.
The question is from Paolo. Martin, do you make any distinction between references as citations and references as supplementary material? i.e., do you capture the reference type?
Yeah. So what we include in event data and goes into Scholix is only the references that are in the bibliography. So supplementary material, supplementary material, if it has a separate DOI, which is a Crossref DOI, if it's a component, for example, that will be in the metadata as a relation, not as a reference. So we don't include in the event data supplementary material.
But why wouldn't you consider to have it, Martin? Well, thanks for the presentation. That was interesting to clarify. Because I think it's yet another interesting link, right?
Yeah.
Very
interesting. We are considering to have that, and one of the changes we're planning for the next few months or so, once we've done work on the infrastructure, is to add cross-ref to cross-ref relations into event data, and that would include the supplementary thing. So if you look in event data at the moment, you won't find that information, but hopefully in a few months' time it will be there.
Martin, there's actually another question. I'm not sure if you're able to open the chat. If you want, I can read it.
I just wasn't reading it. Is this the one from Andrea? Yeah. So the difference between Scholix and event data is really about what is included in the metadata. So if you go to event data, we have a relatively sparse schema because there's very large amounts of data. So from the Crossref, to identify a Crossref article, we literally just have the DOI in there. We don't have the author names, we don't have the journal title, we don't have the title of the work, anything like this. The Crossref schema. I see, yeah, Helena has also posted, I guess that's a link to an article about this. The Scholix schema includes richer metadata about both the article that's citing and the cited data set, which is kind of a shortcut for not having to then query the Crossref metadata API to get whatever information, or the DataCite metadata API to get additional information to what's in event data. I hope that's clear enough. Yeah. Yeah, I just saw the comment from Ian. Yes, it will be it will be interesting, and I haven't actually looked at the volume of what that would be at the moment, but yeah, it would be really interesting to see.
Yeah, I don't feel like there are tons at present, but I know that I know that some publishers are already providing the data in that way, but I also know that some plan to do it, again, sort of comprehensively, like starting in the new year. So it stands, again, it's the kind of thing that stands to grow pretty quickly once this is happening as part of standard workflows.
Yeah, I think unfortunately a lot of publishers probably don't register the supplementary data with a separate DOI as a component, and therefore, you know, it's kind of, the supplementary data is quite hidden, unfortunately. We will see.
And again, we were talking to some folks from the crystallography side the other day, and he said, I think that I do suspect that they'll probably be the sort of front runners. And I think that, again, Ian, I do feel like IUCR have already sent us a pile of stuff as relationships, and are keen for us then to, as you said, to pull that into event data, and therefore into the Scholix endpoint. I feel like people have had lots of time to read the summary slide, and I think these are points that we've sort of reiterated on the way through. It's that I know Andrea had made reference to make data count, which again, I feel like Helena and Martin from DataCite can talk to, but making the information available, then making this information available in terms of those citations and how data is used within, how data is cited with from papers, from preprints, from other types of research, then stands to support the work that Make Data Count are doing around open metrics for research data, and instead rewarding, recognizing, and supporting research by valuing these types of outputs. I'm going to wrap up here, but we're sort of talking from the publisher perspective, but I wanted to hand over to Joris van Rossum, who's been heading up STM's research data year, to talk about the work that he's been doing there. So I'll stop sharing at this point and hand over.
Thanks, Rachel and Martin.
I'm just trying to share my screen. Yeah. All right. Good morning, good evening. Certainly evening for me. I wanted to add a few words to the earlier presentation, talking from the publisher perspective. So I'm with STM. In case you don't know it, it's the trade organization for about 150 publishers in science, technology, and medicine. We represent approximately 70% of published content. And we started a program this year, the research data year. And what we're trying to do is to building on the success of, for example, initiatives like Scholix, but also the development of standard journal policies, is to help publishers to roll these out and thereby stimulate research data sharing by publishers. We have 3 focuses this year, which is sharing data, linking, and citing. And it's really action-based. So we really try to increase the rollout of these tools and services. We do that by supporting publishers by means of workshops, webinars. We have a website, stmresearchdata.org, where we posted a lot of information that was actually presented today about Scholix as well. And also we have a dashboard tracking the progress on how we're doing. So today I have just a few slides just telling you a bit about our progress and about the experiences we have with supporting, helping publishers roll out or implement Scholix. But first maybe to to mention here. So we started with a handful of publishers. We have now almost 20 publishers. As you can see, it's a great representative sample from big publishers, small publishers, mid-sized publishers, profit, non-for-profit, etc. But also in our program, we are working closely with other organizations like the RDA, of course, but also, for example, the Center of Open Science and many others. And also increasingly working with a wider group of stakeholders, including institutions and funders and repositories, because of course research data sharing involves many more parties than just the publishers alone. So as I said, the focus is share, link, and cite, and Scholix is really important for two of those three, link and cite. So rolling out Scholix and implementing it has been a focus for us, and it's continued to be a focus in the coming year, because it's I wouldn't say it's complicated, but there are different systems involved, and there are different possibilities. There are different options, and this is a slide me and my colleagues, some of my colleagues, made a couple of weeks, trying to give an overview of really what steps are involved when you think about submitting data to Crossref in terms of the systems and workflows and the options. So it started with a submission system. That's where the information will be captured, the links to data sets. Of course, there are different submission systems with all different ways to tackle this, but also the data sets can be added or can be submitted in different ways. There is the data availability statement, which is more or less becoming the preferred way to link to data sets, especially when it concerns a data set of an author, him or herself. But it also can be done as a reference, as has been discussed. Then that information has to be moved to the publisher. Then it can also be done in three ways, as stated here. It has to be stored in the data warehouse, and then it has to, of course, be presented on the article page, and it has to be then sent to Crossref, which can happen in a couple of ways, as was explained before. So we have been working the last couple of months trying to get this information together, and really what we try to do now is to put everything together so that all the participating publishers have a clear overview of what they can do and how they can implement Scholix. And again, it's in a way straightforward, but as there are different systems involved and different suppliers, it basically it differs per journal. So we really focus on having a clear overview here. Just a few words of where we are. Oh, sorry, click a bit too far here. So one of the elements of our effort is to have a clear dashboard on where we are. And unfortunately, we have only quite basic information now. That is basically how many of our publishers connect to Scholix, so submits the data to Scholix in a way that allows the links between data sets, articles be registered. That's about a third of the publishers do it now. But we are working on ways to track this better. So we would like to, of course, know what the growth is of the data, the links to data sets. We want to understand what percentage of articles have links to data sets. We want to know how many links are established, how many links are established at submission. And that's another thing I should mention, that what submission systems currently support is that the link is added in the submission process, but coming next year, some of the submission systems will also allow the data sets to be deposited at submission. So that's another workflow opportunity. So we are working on, again, mapping these opportunities. We're working with these different parties to make the end-to-end workflow clear, but also for next year, we want to really measure much more. So we also be able to track better what the growth is and of links to data sets, because of course that's what the whole research data year is about. Maybe one last thing to mention, we talked about supplements versus references. At the moment we really don't care. We want to have as many links to data sets as possible, But of course, whether something is referenced as a data set or whether it's included as a data integrity statement, it also has, of course, a different purpose, and that's also something we would like to measure, because a citation to an external data set is something else than a data set that is submitted by an author as a supplementary. So also we want to differentiate and measure separately. So to conclude, I think we're on the right track. Indeed, the infrastructure is there. There are different things that are being developed. For example, the availability statements. For example, allowing authors to deposit the data set at submission. But I think the basic is there, and we really hope to see next year an increase of publishers submitting their data, but also us being able to track and measure the uptake. So thank you.
Thanks, Joris. Maybe we should check whether there are any questions or comments. I don't see them in the chat, but feel free to jump in. Thought it was interesting, Joris, that you confirm, I guess, to Martin that it would be helpful to at least distinguish data sets that are cited versus data set that are supplement to, and I would completely agree to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because of course, from the publisher perspective, it's important that sharing data sets becomes something that is recognized and being cited. So basically, having your own supplements is, of course, extremely important from the reproducibility perspective, but it's not important from the recognition perspective.
Exactly.
So, yeah, we need to distinguish that.
So there is a question actually, and then maybe after that we should hand over to Helena. So there's a question from Elizabeth Moss. In the future, when data can be deposited upon submission, where will those data be housed, archived, preserved?
Yeah, so it will be deposited in a repository, but the essence is that it can be done in the submission system. So an author doesn't have to go first to a repository to deposit it and then enter the link in the submission process, but it can be done in one go through the interface of the submission system. So the repository will in principle be the same as before.
Thanks. Shall we move on to Helena?
Yeah, sure. I'll share my screen. Oh. All right, so thank you for the invitation. It's nice to be able to present where we are at this point in time. Of course, not as nice as it was last year to all be in a large room in Helsinki and actually be able to talk to each other there, but I guess this is the best we can do right now. So I work for DataCite. DataCite is a global nonprofit membership organization. We work with over 2,000 repositories around the world to provide DOIs for datasets and other research outputs. And I think what's important to note here from a Scholix perspective is that the two talks we just heard were from a publisher perspective. Publishers work with Crossref, and they participate in Scholix and the Scholix framework through Crossref. Whereas our community consists of data repositories, and so they are able to participate in this through us. And so our vision is to connect research to identify knowledge. And I think that's very closely aligned with what we're trying to do here in the Scholix working group, connecting research, and in this specific case, literature to data sets. And so our community right now consists of over 200 members, as I said, over 2,000 repositories in 43 countries, and they've registered over 20 million DOIs. So I think what's important, and this is really kind of back to basic, is that when an organization registers a DOI with us, they submit metadata following our metadata schema. And this is really where they can contribute to the Scholix framework, because when they submit the metadata, they can indicate if there are related identifiers. So that basically means they can indicate whether there are other outputs that are related to the output they're registering a DOI for. So what that looks like, and this is a screenshot from our DOI registration interface, is that they're asked, are there related identifiers? So in this case, I put in a Crossref DOI that's then recognized as being another DOI. I can indicate what the relationship is between these two identifiers. So the one is cited by the other, the data set is cited by the article, and I can indicate what the resource type was of the other output. So this is really the way in which our members can share that information with us, can let us know that their data sets were cited by articles. So this slide is actually one of the main things that I presented last year in Helsinki, and this is about the types of relations. Because using this related identifier functionality, they can actually enter many different types of relationships. And so a question we had last year was, what should we see as a citation? When does something count as a citation? Because we didn't feel we could just include any relationship there. So what we kind of proposed to this working group last year was that we would say a citation is when a data set is referenced by, is cited by, or is supplement to a paper, or when the article references, cites, or is supplemented by the data set. So when we see these relationships in the metadata, then we say, yes, here's a citation. The inverse relationships we count as references, and everything else we have, we just say these are relations. And so this is what I presented last year. And we actually decided to move forward with this. So this is also how we've now implemented it. So last year, I think we were at a point where we were starting to show citations for individual data sets. And we've actually done quite a lot of work since then, which is also why it's nice to be back and show where we are now. Because in the project, in the context of the European Commission funded project Freya, we've been working on something we call the PIT graph. And so that means we've not only spent time looking at the connections between publications and data sets, but we've also started adding other entities within the research ecosystem. So we're now also looking at the people that generated these outputs and the organizations that they're associated with and the funders that funded that research. And by connecting all these different persistent identifiers, we're starting to create that graph. And recently we launched a new service, which we call DataCite Commons, which gives you an interface to actually go into that graph and see these different connections. And so that means we now have a way of displaying citations in different ways. So as I said, the thing we were working on last year was that we were starting to show the citations at the dataset level. So this is an example of a Dryad dataset, which actually has quite some citations. And so within DataCite Commons, you can go to this individual data set and see the citations. But because of all these connections to other identifiers, you can also go to research, and I decided in this case to use Martin as an example. And you can see for that particular researcher also aggregated data metrics. So you can see the number of citations, also views, and the Make Data Count project was already briefly mentioned. And in the context of the Make Data Count project, we've really focused on looking at views and downloads and being able to count and display those as well. And so we're now able to also show these things at a researcher level. And the same is true for the institution level. Also here, within DataCite Commons, as you can see here, you have works, people, organizations. You can also look for organizations, and then for these organizations, see aggregated metrics, so the citations, the views, and the downloads. So the last thing I wanted to show is that so far I've shown how these things are available in DataCite interfaces. but we also wanted the repositories that are sharing this information with us, that are making the effort to put these related identifiers in the metadata, to be able to display the information we have on their own pages. So in the context of the Parsec project, we developed what we call the data metrics badge, which means that there's now a widget available that repositories can show on their own pages to show their data metrics. And so here there's an example from the EDI data portal where you can see a small badge. There are different versions of the badge at the end of the page where they're showing their citations. So yeah, this is a brief update of where we are now, and happy to take questions.
So maybe a question for me. I was wondering where the additional graph information is coming from. Is that submitted by repositories?
I think Martin can provide most information about this.
Well, I'm sure you will be fine, but basically it's what we have from DataCite metadata, which is of course all the data citations provided by repositories. It's metadata from Crossref, which is event data, how it's linked together, and then we're also linking out to people and organizations using ORCID and ROR. So it's all the things that we all know and use. It's just that we spend more effort in aggregating this together in various ways.
But Martin, is Paulo here. So the citations that were mentioned in the interface are the ones between that you have expressed in DataCite, basically.
Yes and no, because we also, that was part of this project, we also started to add Crossref DOIs to the system, which is of course most interesting, the publications that are citing the data sets of DataCite DOIs, but it's really, we need to collect more data and clean up data, but it's really the citation in a general sense.
Yeah, it's quite hard challenge. What is quite disappointing, I think, is the fact that ORCID identifiers are in several cases used badly. So we found huge numbers of mismatches between ORCID identifiers assigned to different names, right? So it's something we realized after a while. And so I was wondering if you're doing, for example, this kind of cleaning, because it's not obvious. I mean, we started rejecting those that were referring to names that were too apart from each other, syntactically and let's say textually matching them, but it's not easy.
Yeah, the short answer is there's a lot of work still ahead. But we rely very heavily on identifiers. We're not trying to do any sort of, let's say, names in particular to assume this is this researcher, but it's, if there's no ORCID, we're not using this. There's of course problems with those, but relying on identifiers doesn't give us all the information, but that makes the information
yes. So there is a more general problem that I think it would be nice also for the publishers to be discussed. Although for the publishers it's probably less than a problem, in fact. But, when you look at the metadata out there, and especially when you are trying to count citations, it's pretty easy to cheat. Not even to cheat, because you're not doing it on purpose, right? But depending on the number, for example, DataCite includes Zenodo, right? And Zenodo has a long list of preprints or slides or presentations that are being deposited there every day. And this may contain references to other objects or to other articles, which may be counted as references, right? And if you count references as citations and you count them as reward, then of course, that's a system that is pretty easy to cheat, because you don't have anybody controlling that what you're depositing is authoritative or relevant or introducing something new at all, right? So even the amount of links that we are collecting from the world in a Scholix Explorer, it's hard to control. from that point of view. You actually cannot control the numbers and associate to the numbers quality, as we are able to do, for example, when a paper is in a journal and has been accepted after peer review and published somewhere. So I think this is a general problem that should be discussed. What is authoritative in terms of citation when you're talking about data sources, so sources of information? You need a sort of certification in a way.
Let me give you a quick answer, but I think we are now segued to the discussion part, and we should make sure that we focus on the data citation. So my short answer is, DataCite does not assume that the numbers we collect have anything to do with credit or impact or anything, because that's just a wild guess that we have. And for DataCite in particular, we have no idea what it means if a data set is cited 10 times, for example. And these sort of cheating, gaming, and whatever, this is a common phenomenon in bibliometrics, and people have spent careers on that. And it's sort of easier with social media and with usage stats than with, for example, citations in the peer-reviewed literature. But it's a general problem. So I don't see that there's anything fundamentally different. And finally, to make progress in this area, in the latest MDC project where we got grant funding this summer, one project partner is a group of bibliometricians to collect data, understand, look at these kinds of questions, because we want to move forward. As you say, we have to move beyond just counting sort of numbers and sticks and say that means something directly without sort of looking at all the factors and more that you just mentioned. And I think that's sort of where we have come with Scholix. I mean, at the beginning, we were just happy when we could count things and see connections in the system we have envisioned. I think right now we're in a phase where we basically worry about too many things get stuck or not reported. And I think we will get to the point where we worry about what does it all mean, and is it really true that this data set has been cited 20,000 times? And we have data sets that are cited 20,000 times, but that's because it's used in a very different way, which is, for example, the biodiversity community in GBIF, which is just tracking occurrences of species, and that's sort of a very different kind of citation. So I think we are moving forward there, but that's just sort of an introduction to the final 25 minutes we have.
Exactly. I wanted to kind of say maybe short bridge to Paolo, and then let's move into discussion.
But before we get there, Paolo, it's your turn, and I'm not sure whether you pick up these topics, or I think you have.
Yeah, no worries. I'll try to be quick because it's just a few numbers that I want to show. And where is the presentation now? Okay, here it is. No, not desktop. I can't see it. Oh, come on. Oh, here it is. Okay. Can you see it? Can you see the slide?
Yep.
Okay. So I will also try to put it in presentation mode. Can you see it now?
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay. Yeah, I just started the note not to be confused with Scholix. Actually, it occurred to me after a while that people started confusing the framework with the service that is now aggregating data sources that comply to the framework. And so this is what I'm going to talk about today, is Scholix Explorer. It's a service that is part of the OpenAIRE portfolio. OpenAIRE is the open science scholarly communication infrastructure for Europe, and is one of the services that we offer. In short, what the service does is to harvest from different data sources the link metadata, possibly under Scholix, although in some cases this is not still an option. So what we're waiting for the sources to comply, we collect according to their original metadata formats. For example, could be DataCite or other compatible formats we're dealing with. We harvest the metadata from the raw sources. In several cases, we have to resolve the identifiers because we internally, we collect, in Scholix Explorer, we collect the full record of an object together with the outgoing record. And of course, we want to have the other object on the other side. So I'm sure you understand that when you have an object with a DOI, you need to resolve the DOI to get the full metadata from the objects on the other side and build the inverse links. So we are keeping links from both sides and the objects, and we keep reasonable amount of metadata for the objects, so beyond the mandatory fields imposed by Scholix. So resolving is one of the issues that we have. So we are including, for example, resolvers for tens of different persistent identifiers out there, including the DOIs from, of course, DataCites and Crossref, but also from the set of identifiers.org and the individual ones like the PDBs and so on, ENAs, etc. Now, when you put all these things in one place, the first thing you have to cope with is duplication. So we perform the duplication. The duplication, as Wouter has mentioned, is not an easy task. We do it at two levels. We do it at the level of the PIDs. So we assume that when two objects have the same PID are the same object, not vice versa. So two objects may have different PIDs and still be the same object, in fact, especially if there's different versions of the same object. And when we identify objects that are the same, we merge them. So we put them together, we create one object, and we merge together with it all the relationships. We keep track of every single bit of information. So we know when an object comes from different sources because we keep all the providers of these objects, but also at the level of the relationships. In fact, this is what we're very interested about. So the relationships. So each relationship, we know from which sources has been provided and if it's a duplicate, basically, so that we can provide it to the consumers of the service via Scholix under Scholix format. Just a few numbers that you can see here. For example, from DataCite, we started including we call it the data sets in DataCite. So we basically collected a number of resource types in the collection of DataCite that we want to associate to this concept, which is vague enough, of data sets, and we started a collection from there. We collecting from Europe PMC. We're collecting also from Elsevier. As Martin mentioned before, event data is on the way. In fact, so this set of Elsevier comes partly from Crossref event data, previous harvest, and partly from static collections that we had when we started all this initiative. And as you can see, many others are there, which are directly or indirectly collected, some of them via DataCite itself. Okay, so these numbers are summarized here. So as you can see, when we harvest, in terms of objects, we have 361 million publications, 175 data sets, and you can see the amount of relationships. So it's more than 4 billions, right? We also have objects of unknown type. These are objects typically identified by a URL, for which it's impossible to resolve, for which it's impossible to know the type or identify the type, unless you develop crawlers that go over the internet and try to fetch information. That's not possible for us, so it's out of our scope. And after the duplication, you see the reduction of content that we have. So you can tell the amount of duplication that we have. Overall, we have 36 million publications that are linked to datasets and vice versa. Again, we are keeping in Scholix Explorer only objects that bear at least one link to another, okay? So when we inspect the whole Crossref or the whole datasets or the whole DataCite, we only keep those objects who bear a link, outgoing or incoming link. In terms of provision, what you see up there is a classifications of the relationships that we have. You should consider this bidirectional. So in the index, you will find both directions. So when you interact with the Scholix Explorer API, if you provide the DOI, you get back all the outgoing / incoming edges to that DOI, for example. The same for the PID. Thanks to an agreement we have with DataCite, we have a SLA, and we are keeping the index up to date every 15 minutes. So any new entry in DataCite which bears a link to another object is immediately made available through the index. Of course, it won't go through the resolution and the duplication in the first place, because this takes place every 2 or 3 days, because it's a quite big and time-consuming process. But you can see and you can immediately benefit from the APIs and the resolution on the fly every 15 minutes. Now, we also publish a dump, a big dump of data. Actually, we have published the last version yesterday. So there's fresh data, just go download it and enjoy it, because there's a lot of new content, including the whole EMBOL EBI, links from publications to datasets, so you can play with it, do your research, and or also run your professional services. Please cite us. This is very important for us. So when you look at a dump, you can cite the dump or the articles that are describing the Scholix Explorer service. You can find information on the terms of use. And that is it. So if you have any questions on the Scholix Explorer, otherwise I keep going. Anything in the chat? Okay. So
yeah, well, it's good to go on, because otherwise we really don't have time for more.
Yes. So just 2 last slides. This is just to let you know that we have recently, last year, launched a new interest group this year in RDA. The group follows the path paved by Scholix and goes into the direction of the open science graphs. So intended basically as a sort of let's say a collection of information that bear links between different entities, research entities, describe their relationships, possibly include information and metadata about the individual entities, and allow any sort of operation and action on top, from discovery, monitoring, statistics, etc., making science transparent. So these graphs are embracing the open science movement. So the idea is to make the whole science process, the whole scientific process, better described. So how publications are related with data and software, how these are combined, possibly linked to services or facilities, how you can reproduce an experiment, how you can reward all the people and the contributors of science, or even how these are connected to funding, possibly. So your publishers, your projects, and so on. So these graphs rely on registries, rely on data sources, and the hard task is to combine them and bring them together, like we're doing in Scholix, like Freya is doing with the PID graph. So the huge efforts of aggregation, each of them bringing skills and understanding that is very different from the other. So the idea here was to study how these open science graphs can interoperate in the future. So how they can benefit from nice data exchange models, simple ones, as Scholix has been, and how these open science graphs could basically count on each other to improve the way science is shared, accessed, and reused. So there are several challenges that you can read here. I won't go through each of them because they require a lot of time. But if you're interested or if you want to know more, please join the interest group. And you will hear from us soon, because we have an idea of running a workshop and bring new faces in to discuss these aspects. So I'm done. Also on this topic, if you have any questions.
Thank you, Paolo. We have almost 15 minutes left, and we wanted to have a little bit of discussion. The idea was that there might be people on this call today who are new to Scholix and they just have basic questions, and it's a perfect opportunity to ask that. There were a few questions in the chat. and in the doc, but I'm not sure there's any burning questions. So if you have something about understanding a presentation or what is this Scholix thing after all, so please speak now or put something in the chat so we can address that maybe for a few minutes, and then we can move to a broader discussion. Anything that is still not clear after we worked very hard for 1 hour to explain what Scholix is and why it's important and who is part of it, etc. Okay, so this can either be a good sign or a bad sign. We don't have to answer that. Of course, we are an RDA working group in maintenance mode, so you can always reach out to us, for example, via the mailing list or reaching out to individual people and organizations that presented today. So, which really means we have a few minutes left to ask a different kind of a set of questions, which is, we are in maintenance mode. We had said, when we had sort of done our sort of outputs and recommendations, that we need the maintenance mode to basically increase adoption, and the presentations you have heard, for example, from STM, made it very clear there's still work to do, and Scholix is part of this work. But at some point, we might feel comfortable that either we have addressed enough problems or we have identified new problems that need more activity and coordination at RDA than a group in maintenance mode can provide. So the question really for the last 10 minutes is, what's the next big thing for Scholix? Or so either this group of people or an activity that's sort of spun out of the work we've done here. And the last slides from Paolo is sort of indicate one direction this could take, which is, of course, there's lots of other working in interest group in RDA, and there's sort of lots of overlapping interest, and open science graphs is one example where obviously this information about data citation is very valuable. But I want to start with a sort of more open question of ideas or wishes people have where Scholix should go. And again,
kick it off with a question. One question we discussed in our smaller monthly meeting was, for example, if there's a given domain that is underrepresented in Scholix, should we maybe do a special effort like we've done with STM, like Joris is leading with STM and Rachel and Martin are doing from Crossref side, so there's a special effort to focus on publishers. But maybe we should also do a special effort to focus on specific domains to kind of get additional article data links on board when we see that they're underrepresented. And my hypothesis, actually, which turned to be false, was that in the medical domain, there seems to be some underrepresentation, which actually turned out to be false. In the medical domain, actually, article data links are actually fairly well established. But that's a question maybe for the group. Should we focus on a specific domain to get more uptake? And if so, what domain?
And I think it's really for the people who are in a time zone that is convenient for this sort of profound discussion. So which is really the Americas. And maybe we're getting to the time where people like Adrian, who I see on my screen, is now getting fully awake. And of course, Adrian, we didn't say that at the beginning because I think he also joined a little bit later. Of course, he has been with Scholix from more than the beginning.
Yes, as I said in the chat, this is the best possible time for a Scholix that I've ever had in my career. Just done it just perfectly at breakfast time, so well done. So some reflections on the presentations were absolutely marvelous. There's an amazing amount of really fundamental progress there. I think in answer to Wouter's question, it's well, both of you were asking about the maintenance mode of this group, or how do you know what success is? And well, look, just because I have been around for a little while. I do remember at the very first face-to-face meeting of this group, of the Scholix working group, Wouter said we need to have some metrics of success. You know, how do we know when we've got, you know, how are we going to measure whether it's been successful or not? And as with anything, you know, how do you know when to stop? You know, what sort of goal have you set yourself? So I think that actually the stuff that was presented by STM, by Joris, is that right? That really gives us a good, one aspect of, you know, what the goal is. You know, what is that coverage? And so I think that bringing that into the Scholix initiative and saying, well, what is the coverage we've got? And then you can ask some of the questions that Wouter was asking. Okay, where are the areas that we've got, you know, where do we want to get coverage? But anyway, so I think that idea of what is the coverage of the linkages between data sets and publications, and because I think that's actually the specific thing, the really amazing thing about the Scholix working group is it's not just, it's technical and social and organizational, and, you know, we set ourselves a task that says, you know, whatever it takes. So we've got the, you know, the outreach arms of both DataCite and Crossref working, you know, with communities to make this happen, and, you know, pushing forward to a certain coverage, I think is really you know one of the ways in which we can measure success there.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful, because that's something we're still struggling with, even though you saw lots of numbers today. But for example, are the numbers that Scholix Explorer is providing similar or different what DataCite knows or Crossref knows or STM? And if they are different, why is that so? And sort of, because I see Rory's question in the chat is sort of the disciplinary coverage, which disciplines are sort of good in doing data citations. There's fundamental problems. So we had a little discussion in the last Scholix call about what Wouter just said about which disciplines might be over underrepresented. And one challenge is that what Wouter does or did is using the subject classification from the articles, because for data sets, that's not really, there's no really the standard way. You have to sort of do all the manual work. And that's, for example, something we have started at DataCite, that we really want to know whether social sciences are doing better, which there's lots of social science data citations, or engineering is doing poorly. That it really starts with some of the fundamentals which go beyond data citation. So I think having tracking metrics, agreeing on what are the goals, because it's probably something realistic. Not 100% of articles now have a data set connected, or maybe it is a data availability statement. And also if there are differences that between different people doing this, because it's really a framework and it should be 100% the same, but if there's vast differences, why is that so? So that we feel more comfortable where we are. I mean, we feel we have made progress since Scholix started, but I think it's hard to say how much progress and in what areas in particular.
Australia is being criticized at the moment for not signing up to the Paris agreements, or you know, not taking them seriously, and that's all about having a goal. You know, it's zero emissions by 2050 or whatever the actual goal is. Once you've got that, then you have ways of working back. Say, okay, what are the things we need to measure? What are the agreements that need to be in place? And I think that's where the other work, you know, that was really important today around making data count and the bibliometrics of just understanding then what is it, you know, given that goal, you know, what are we measuring, and you know, what do we mean by citation? There's actually some very nice work to be done there as well. And then the other side, I think, also is getting the reward information back to the participants, which is starting to happen really nicely as well with the big dumps and the widgets. And I think that's part of making it an ongoing ecosystem, is that the information is, there's two parties, you know, the the data creator actually is getting the information all the way back to the data creator that someone has used the data set, and then the other way around, to these publishers who have, enormous amount of information about scholarly communications, but where is it linked to data? So anyway, getting the information back to those two parties sort of then shows the whole value of the system.
Because we now have only 3 minutes left, I think there's only time for one more question and maybe hopefully multiple answers, which is a topic that the Scholix group has asked itself once a year, which is, should we expand to other things beyond data citation, which, for example, includes, obvious one in RDA would be software citation. And Adrian, not for sort of putting on the spot, but I think you have been one of those who said, well, we're not quite there yet. And I think what you just said is, wow, there's a lot of work left to do. And if you sort of spread yourself too thin, then that there's a risk of, we haven't really done this properly for the data citation, and are we moving on to something else too fast, or should that be a different group of people pushing that? So maybe a few comments on this topic. Is Scholix ready to conquer the next mountain, or is that sort of still focus on all these things that need to be done, including adoption and including what Adrian just said in terms of where are we and how can the data freely flow, etc.
It's always been easy to, from the informatics science point of view, to use the Scholix model and data model and schema, etc., and branch that out. And I think people are already doing that. So I think, in one sense, just the information science side of it, the linking, using a PID, using a relation, using an object type, and then building out graphs there. I think we are and should be involved in building that out into a more complex molecule rather than just the two types. Excuse me, Ian, for being very amateur there. However, when you get back to, Martin made a really interesting comment there when he was asked about, how are you getting the information about organizations and people, etc. And Martin said, look, if there's an identifier, if it's covered, we show it, and if not, we can't do anything about it. Scholix has never said that, where we've said, if it's not linked, then we're going to work with culture, we're going to work with STM, we're going to work with Crossref to make it happen. So there are two different types of initiative. There's the information science part of it, and there's the actual scholarly culture and scholarly communication side of it. So I think the answer is it is both. It's okay to expand the information science side of it and use the Scholix core. The actual coverage of those links, really is a cultural and social thing, which I think Scholix has got the right people to keep working
on. We have run out of time, and we have a sort of plenary closing session ahead of us. So I suggest that this was just a snapshot of the discussion. So the easiest way to add stuff, for example, tomorrow morning, if you're in Europe right now and you feel fresher, you can just add to the Google Doc or you send an email. So if there's thoughts that you want to capture after the session closes, do so. And then I think this group continues to be in maintenance mode. And I think there were lots of good ideas in the session today where to move forward. And I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. Thank you all for joining us for this session.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Day.
Have a good day. Yes. Good night.
We'll close it off.